Hello class, we're finally in the 20th century with Latin American history, and our topic today is the chapter titled Between Revolutions. Deals with the new political class and the economics of import substitution into industrialization in Latin America from 1920 through 1959. So the title comes from the fact that the chapter begins at the end of the Mexican Revolution and ends at the beginning, or at least at the culmination, of the Cuban Revolution, hence the Between Revolutions. So let us begin. So the introduction to the era of revolutions. This was this began with the Mexican Revolution and ended with the Cuban Revolution. It was a continuation of the dilemmas of Latin American politics and economy. You see there a picture of Pancho Villa on the left with General Blackjack John J. Pershing when they were getting along. Global historical factors included 2 world wars and a Great Depression, and then the onset of the Cold War after the end of the Second World War. The same questions persisted as in Chapter 9. Who was to govern? And for whom, and how? The upper classes resisted the demands of workers. The militaries allied themselves mostly with the upper class conservatives, with a few exceptions like Mexico, which we shall see. Left political groups, socialists and communists, made modest gains, but not very serious ones. Populism comprised of cross-class alliances under charismatic leaders advocating social reform dominated politics. So this was the era of populism. It was an attempt to forge cross-class alliances and to incorporate workers and the poor into the national political process in a more effective way. The lower classes began to join labor unions. Workers were valuable allies for the rival middle class and upper class political parties. Regionalism forced dictators such as Perón, Juan Domingo Perón, and Getulio Vargas of Brazil to ally themselves with provincial and state political bosses. The 1930s strengthened the role of government intervention in economics. This was even true in the United States with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The aftermath of World War I. There had been an export boom from the 1870s to the 1920s in Latin America. The uncertainties and costs of the booms and busts associated with the economic reliance on exports in the global market system led to difficulties in Latin America. During World War I, there had been a brief economic boom that proved detrimental in the long run to Latin American culture because it persuaded farmers and producers to borrow money on credit to get more land and plant more crops. Domestic manufacturing seemingly had unprecedented opportunities in Latin America, but no capital to develop themselves with. A few export commodities were sent to a handful of markets. 4 countries, the United States, United Kingdom, France, and Germany, accounted for 70% of the trading partners with Latin America. And of course, they were all at war in World War I and World War II. In 1919, the Cuban Dance of Millions began, which was a rapid inflation and then a bust of the sugar market. The price of sugar went up rapidly and then collapsed, which led to major problems in Cuba. There were many one-product nations that focused most of their national income on the production and export of one product. Brazil was primarily coffee, so was Colombia. In Cuba, it was primarily sugar. So this wreaked havoc with the Latin American economies, the Great Depression. The recovery began in 1931 through 32, but it impeded the flow of imports from Europe and the United States. In Latin America, there were a number of countries that were considered to be monoculture nations, in which one product in each accounted for at least 50% of the exports. This in addition to Brazil, Colombia, and Cuba, it also included Bolivia, which exported tin, Honduras and El Salvador, which exported bananas, Guatemala, which exported coffee and bananas, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and the Dominican Republic. The Cuban sugar industry had been ruined by the dance of millions. Manufacturing did not flourish. There was low productivity and shortages of cheap labor. Shortages of cheap power. There was a lack of skilled labor, lack of credit, obsolete machinery, overprotection, tariffs that were too high, lack of foreign investment from the United States and Europe. In Honduras, which was dependent on the export of bananas, that was particularly hard hit. The fastest recoveries were among Brazil, Mexico, Chile, Cuba, Peru, and Venezuela. Also Costa Rica and Guatemala. There was slower recoveries in the rest of the countries listed here. World War II hit Latin America harder than the Depression in the previous World War. There was a drop in U.S. and European imports. Industrialization expanded in several nations. For example, in Brazil, the Volta Redonda steelworks were established with technical assistance from the United States. Latin America accumulated financial reserves from the sale of exports, but unfortunately it caused an increase in the cost of living, or inflation, which created social unrest by the end of the war. Peacetime economies. These changes solved few of the region's problems, particularly the accumulation of reserves. Latin America suffered from the decline of U.S. purchases of primary products. Also, the elimination of cooperative mechanisms, technical assistance, and capital. Cheaper European and U.S. products flooded Latin America in the post-war period. The U.S. turned to Europe. There were no resources for Latin America for assistance. The slow European recovery limited markets. Latin American nations faced a dilemma about how to spend large foreign exchange reserves built up during the war. Argentina built railroads and repaid its debt. Most countries spent their reserves, triggering inflation. The United States focused on Europe in order to counter the looming threat of Soviet communism. So government resources were no longer available for Latin America, which forced Latin America to rely on the insufficient private sector capital investment. Latin America turned inward in the late 1940s, developing a economic strategy called ISI, or Import Substitution Industrialization, which might have been effective 50 or 60 years earlier, but was critically flawed at this point in time. The social question remained preeminent in Latin American politics through the world wars and crises. Latin American nations alternated between limited democracy and dictatorship, sometimes in correlation with the booms and busts in the world economy. There was an increase in democratic populism. In the 1920s, electoral populism brought concessions to women and new aspiring classes. On the left there, you see a picture of Hipólito Yrigoyen, who was a president of Argentina and a populist that tried to enlist the support of the working classes. And here you see Chile's Arturo Alessandri, another populist. So the democratically elected populists included Hipólito Yrigoyen from the Radical Party of Argentina. In Chile, Arturo Alessandri. In Peru, Augusto B. Legua. In Cuba, Gerardo Machado, who became a dictator, which ignited the first Cuban Revolution in 1933. The 1920s through the 30s were troubling times for traditional social order. In the 1920s, middle classes feared that their societies were coming apart. Sounds like today, huh, in the United States? There was also a transformation of women's roles. Women worked more frequently in visible urban settings, in factories and offices. They organized and staged strikes. The new free woman was sexually active and cigarette smoking. The feminists' main objective was equality in law, which was not obtained until the 1930s. The Great Depression put the upper classes and the middle class in competition for shrinking resources. The Radical Party of Argentina formed an alliance between the middle class and elements of the landowning upper class. In Peru, Leguía focused on the middle class and the country people as his basis of support. He used a massive program of public works and rebuilt Lima. In 1923, the Peruvian army killed 2,000 peasants, bringing to an end Leguia's popularity as a populist. In Chile, the upper classes refused concessions to the middle and lower classes. The parliamentary republic simply did not work due to the social unrest. Strikes tore apart the northern nitrate region of Chile. So in the 1910s, Arturo Alessandri drew support from working classes and initiated sweeping reforms and support for women's issues. In Cuba, populism evolved into a dictatorship in response to the Depression. On the left you see Gerardo Machado, who had been the youngest general in the 1898 or 1897 War for Independence. The collapse in the sugar prices in 1920 contributed. Ineffective and corrupt government was a major factor. The Platt Amendment was extremely unpopular in Cuba. In 1929, the sugar and tobacco prices collapsed. Gerardo Machado resorted to brutality to maintain power and was ousted in 1933 by students and the military, including a young sergeant named Fulgencio Batista, who would later repeat history and become another Gerardo Machado. In 1933 was the first Cuban Revolution. Mexico was different because its middle class had allied itself with workers and peasants during the revolution. You see General Álvaro Obregón on the left there. The upper classes had been ruined by the revolution. In the 1920s through the mid-1930s, Mexicans struggled to rebuild their destroyed economy after a decade of civil war. Middle classes demanded fair and equal access to education, employment, and economic opportunities. Landless peasants fought to regain lands, and the Constitution of 1917 guaranteed return of land. The revolutionary government redistributed land whenever it was necessary to placate the lower classes. There's Plutarco Elias Calles, who was the protege of General Álvaro Obregón. He ruled behind the scenes through 3 presidential terms of 6 years. Obregón and Calles allied with the workers. They founded and built a new political party called the National Party of the Revolution, PNR, which later became known as the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, which ruled Mexico for 60 years. In 1934, President Lázaro Cárdenas came to power. His major accomplishment was redistribute 49 million acres of land to 15 million Mexicans. He finally fulfilled Emiliano Zapata's quest to restore these lands to the lower classes. He also doubled the average wage of urban workers. In 1938, he expropriated foreign-owned oil companies, and this led to some tension with the United States, as you might imagine. Fulgencio Batista was the sergeant stenographer who led the military lower officers in the first Cuban Revolution in 1933. He won election in 1940, ruled through World War II, retired to Florida in 1944. Later, he took power again in an illegal coup in 1952, which led directly to the Cuban Revolution of Fidel Castro, which I'll talk about elsewhere. Brazil's middle and lower classes were the politically weakest in Latin America. In 1930, the old order fell apart when it experienced the Depression. A power-sharing arrangement fell apart between São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Minas Gerais after a drastic drop in coffee prices, and this gave rise to Getúlio Vargas from Rio Grande do Sul, which you see there in the red on the left in the map. He became a Brazilian dictator, ruled Brazil for 15 years. He was also a populist. He launched a coup and he established Estado Novo in 1937. He ultimately committed suicide in the early 1950s. when he was about to be overthrown. And that's all we can talk about for now. I'm not going to have time to talk about Argentina and Perón.